Welcome back to Heart of the Matter. I'm Dr. Michael Stevens from the University of New South Wales, and I'm joined as always by the indomitable Dr. Claire Hanson from Australian National University and the irreplaceable Dr. Breed Phillips from Edith Cowan University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Nice to be here again.
Likewise.
Lovely, flattering introduction.
I had to think of two words starting with I to get the nice alliteration going, and I think I chose well.
So is that you, Michael, coming over to the dark side, to the humanities? We love it.
Maybe, but don't tell my engineering colleagues. Like, superfluous adjectives, don't do it. In today's episode, we're going to be exploring a very important book for our purposes, and one that you may already be familiar with, and that is Nikki Stamp's Can You Die of a Broken Heart? Dr. Stamp is a heart and lung surgeon and a fellow of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons in Cardiothoracic Surgery. What's so interesting about her book is its intersection of popular and medical understandings of the heart. The book is highly accessible, it's written for a popular rather than academic audience, and it covers a wide range of topics related to heart health. Things like stress, to heart transplants and mechanical hearts, female hearts, food, exercise, depression, family history, and a lot more. So what stands out from reading the book is that Dr. Stamp is clearly really passionate about her subject matter. The premise of the book is to share her fascination of the heart, and in the hopes that readers will, in quotes, fall in love with their own hearts and take better care of them physically and emotionally.
Yes, it is absolutely fabulous to see a female cardiothoracic surgeon. I mean, we always need important role models, especially for those young women coming through. So she does this admirably. And she's also an advocate for women's health disease, heart health and disease. And according to her website, which we will link to you after this, she's also undertaking a PhD in women's heart disease as well. There's a lot of hearts, health and disease happening there, but I got it out, people.
You always do.
Well done. And for me, this it raises an important question, well, for all of us really, around the representation of hearts and gender. Working with you, Michael, and learning more about artificial hearts and their history, I was quite shocked when I discovered the gender bias in their design. So I was hoping to start off with perhaps an elaboration, if you'd be willing to give us that, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we covered briefly in our paper in 2021. I'm still not used to saying that as last year, but in our 2021 medical humanities paper, it was kind of a footnote in that paper. We kind of saw this gender bias in the early designs of LVADs and total artificial hearts, which aren't really designed for the female body. So there was a study of about 115 thoracic CT scans from patients with various cardiac pathologies. And they found that this artificial heart, the Carmat total artificial heart, was found to fit comfortably in the chests of about 86% of male patients, but only 14% of female patients. So you've got this new artificial heart, and this paper's from 2014, but this artificial heart's now actually just gone for FDA approval. So it's getting close to market and actually going to be deployed and implanted into people, but it can only fit in 14% of women. So it's kind of...
This isn't a new design. Sorry, an old design. This is a new design.
This is a new artificial heart.
It still doesn't fit women.
Yeah. So like the artificial heart technologies take from inception to actual putting it FDA approval takes about 10 to 15 years, right? So it takes a very long time, but still that was like early 2000s and people should have been quite aware of the fact that, you know, women get heart failure too. Women need artificial hearts too, right? But the fact that it only fits in 14% of women is shocking.
Yeah, that is absolutely shocking. And this is something that Stamp covers in her book. She devotes a whole chapter to the medical mysteries of a woman's heart. And she also raises a very, very important point in the introduction to her book. She says women's heart disease is actually quite different to heart disease that afflicts men. So she explains, and I'm quoting here, so I'm reading from over here, my notes over here. Women have very different symptoms such as tiredness or shortness of breath, doing something that used to be easy. Blockages form differently in a woman's heart with its smaller blood vessels and the protection of estrogen. So the disease and the symptoms are different. In fact, scientists and doctors are still trying to work out how different treatments affect women's hearts compared to men's. So, women's hearts are in so many ways different to the men's, and this is something that she elaborates on as well. She looks at the size of the heart, the difference in the the construction of the heart muscle, and the effects of pregnancy on the heart. So because pregnancy has a huge biomechanical change effects on the heart as well.
It's really fascinating, and I think this point is such a crucial one for not only clinicians but also for patients. And reading this and kind of reflecting on what you've just said, Breed, it makes me wonder how many of us actually know that heart disease in women presents differently. This is relatively new information for me. This is definitely not something that I think of as kind of common knowledge. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. When we think about cultural representations of heart disease, say the way heart attacks might be depicted in popular culture, television, film, whatever, I think it would be fascinating to think about the representation of male versus female incidents and what kind of symptoms are typically depicted. I think there'd be interesting comparisons to make between what medicine knows or doesn't yet know and about women and heart disease, and how literature, culture, media represents that. So also historically as well, how this gendered difference in heart disease has been understood or misunderstood.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Stamp's book covers a wide territory, but as you can see today, we're really going to focus on her interest in women's heart health. So she begins her opening chapter with an acknowledgement of the complexity of heartbreak, right? She recognizes that when you think about your heartbreak, it's not just emotional pain. Your heart actually may feel hurt. So right away, there's this recognition of this interplay between physical and emotional. So she recognizes that the connection between the mind and physical health has been debated for a long time, and that heartbreak is a very key example of this. She writes that heartbreak is one of the most powerful emotions that we feel. When your heart is shattered into a million pieces, you feel like you may just expire. But the question is, can you really die of a broken heart? So Breed, what do you think? Can we actually die from a broken heart?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is where we can introduce ourselves to the syndrome, broken heart syndrome, or because this was identified quite recently, in recent terms, medically speaking, and called Takotsubo-Cardiomyopathy, or stress-induced cardiomyopathy. So this is actually something that Claire and I are working on at the moment, in relation to depictions of broken hearts in Shakespeare and early modern drama. So we will touch on Takotsubo syndrome later in the podcast series. So wait for that one. So just to give you a little recap here, what is Takotsubo syndrome? So as I said, it was only described quite recently. It began to appear in the literature around the 1990s. And it was also popularly known as broken heart syndrome. But you'll see it in the academic journals as Takotsubo syndrome, or TTS. So it's a transient and often reversible type of acute coronary syndrome or cardiomyopathy. So I'll turn to my notes, because broken heart syndrome is, as Stamp explains, and I'm quoting her here again, similar to a heart attack. The body's emotions cause the release of a huge amounts of hormones that lead the coronary arteries to spasm and squeeze down, limiting vital blood supply to the precious heart muscle cells. And when heart muscle cells are damaged, they don't pump well. So the syndrome was named after the Japanese fishing pots. So when you look at it on a scan, you'll see this apical ballooning in the left ventricle. So it's quite a distinct shape, and this shape in the acute phase of the syndrome is very similar to the Japanese fishing pot. So that's what it's been called, and they use these pots to catch octopi, octopuses, octopedes. Anyway, that's another podcast in itself, isn't it? So, yeah, and then it has this ballooning out and this narrow neck as well. So that's where it's got its name.
It's a very random kind of origin story for that, but all right. And in terms of the causes of broken heart syndrome or Takotsubo syndrome, the causes are emotions. So emotional stresses that have been cited in literature on this syndrome include things like anger, response to an accident, response to death or illness or injury of a family member, a friend, a pet, emotional response to a natural event like an earthquake or financial loss, legal problems, moving, public speaking, the feeling of panic, an emotional response to receiving bad news, having an argument, or even a surprise party. So it's events designed, well, not designed, but events that give us very strong or perhaps unexpected emotional responses. Most often, the stressful event triggers are negative, but there are a minority of incidents, so surprise party, for example, which would be classified as perhaps positive events. Some studies in the research that Reid and I have done have noted that in older sufferers, there is more often no triggering event, whereas younger and middle-aged patients more often presented with an emotional trigger. And there's also the prevalence of psychiatric disorders as well, which is higher in younger patients.
It's fascinating that this idea that a severe emotional response can actually cause a physical heart attack. You know, it's absolutely fascinating. It's something that like I certainly wasn't aware of when we first started looking into this, and I think a lot of people will be quite surprised to hear about this. The other thing that Nikki Stamp points out is that there's a gendered element to Takotsubo syndrome, and in fact she says that women are much more likely to be affected by broken heart syndrome. Now, she claims that up to 90% of patients with this syndrome are female. So why is this the case? And as she points out, it is not as simple as stereotyping women as being more emotional and thus more likely to experience this syndrome. It's not as simple as stereotyping like that. So she points to a range of cellular processes, body signals and hormones, and the way that the body handles fatty acids or glucose, and also the importance of estrogen. And as Stamp says, estrogen protects the heart so that when it starts to decline in menopause, the heart may be more vulnerable.
Yes, so her book really puts front and center a topic that's quite under-discussed, and that is women's heart health. So she writes that the heart disease is the leading cause of death in women. This is one of the biggest untold stories of women's health, under-acknowledged by women and healthcare professionals alike. Now, this is actually mind-blowing. I mean, when I thought about, morbidity in women, I would think maybe things, to me are more obvious, like, breast cancer, those kind of conditions. So this was actually mind-blowing for me. Anyone else think that this would be happening?
Surprised me. Very much surprised me.
Completely taken aback by that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, what this is then is a hugely important public health message, and I think this is where the health humanities can usefully come into play. So we can interrogate things like gender issues around our knowledge and our communication of heart health information, and get to the root of why we think the way we think and why we find it so hard to shift that thinking as well. So Stamp reminds us that, quoting again, women's hearts are structurally different to men's, and they experience heart attacks differently. And this is really important. We sort of mentioned that briefly earlier, but most of the research that has been done on heart health and heart disease has been done by men on men. And that's, again, another mind-blowing moment, really, isn't it? When you think of 50% of the population, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a very frustrating state of affairs, really. And as you say, Bree, the question that intrigues me here is how, as you say, a health humanities perspective might be able to contribute to this. There seems to me that there would be expertise in gender theory, gender studies that could be usefully brought to bear on this topic, and perhaps that's already work that's being done. I don't know, but in her discussion of women's heart health, Stamp quickly turns to cultural portrayals. She writes, and I'm also quoting, our society has traditionally portrayed a woman's heart in books, films, and fairy tales as something fragile and delicate, a prize to be won or broken by someone who doesn't reciprocate her love. So implicitly here, Stamp is briefly, but nonetheless, she's still doing some health humanities work here, I think. And that's something that could be much further extended. I mean, how do we, in literature, in film, television, pop culture, in media, how do we represent men's and women's hearts and heart health? I think it would be really useful to look at this through the lens of something like, for example, Judith Butler's gender performativity, the theory of gender performativity. Our expectations of how people perform their gender roles has health implications in many ways, but for one way it does is how we think about male and female identified bodies and the hearts within them.
Or in some cases, it's how we actually don't think about it. So Stamp's book tells us that until the late 90s, heart disease wasn't seen as something that generally affected women. So just imagine that, like up until the late 90s, they all just thought it was a man's problem that affected men. Like that's kind of how I've interpreted that statement. And so that's so recent. That's not a long time ago at all. And to pick up on your mention of performance, Claire, it's also depicted in a lot of ways inaccurately. So, I mean, cast your mind back to last time you saw on TV or a movie someone having a heart attack, right? There's usually clutching of the arm or the chest and like a stagger and a collapse on the floor. And, maybe they're dramatically reaching for their phone or something like that. They can't quite get there. But as Nikki Stamp writes in her book, it's not usually how these things go. You're more likely to feel a crushing chest pain and you might feel sick and vomit. However, in women, though, that feeling is a lot less common. So only about 50% of women who have a heart attack actually report those symptoms that we might associate with a heart attack. Women's symptoms are a lot trickier to understand or to kind of or identify. They might include things like jaw pain, belly or back pain, fatigue, or shortness of breath. So these symptoms aren't really something that you and I would immediately associate with a heart attack based on our knowledge of heart attacks in pop culture, right? So it would be very strange having, those symptoms and your brain wouldn't click immediately that was a heart attack. The other thing is that these symptoms aren't really dramatic or exciting. Stamp quips in her book, Hollywood would be bored out of its mind with what a real heart attack looks like, which is kind of reality, But just the fact that she keeps coming back to this popular dramatic representations really shows how influential Hollywood and TV is about representing what a heart attack looks like.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think this is really somewhere where we can actually get a bit of traction in disseminating this heart health message. I think a project based in health humanities can meet the middle ground between those medical concerns and between those representations in the popular discourses. And we could use this sort of niche liminal space to actually unpack those gendered concerns around women's heart health. The fact that we have that stock image, is something that needs to be dispelled. So, while you were speaking there, I started thinking about where do we see representations of, male or female heart disease in literature, drama, film, or so on, So Stamp did mention that in the 2003, I think it was, rom-com, Something's Gotta Give. who was that? Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson. Yes, Jack Nicholson's character has a heart attack. So, that's one that would stick in the mind. But then I was trying to think of, while you were speaking, although I was fascinated with what you were saying as well, but I was also thinking about where we could come up with a woman's example of heart attack in a movie or a TV show. So thinking on the fly, I didn't come up with much.
Yeah, I can't really think of any examples of women having heart attacks in TV shows or on film. I can think of a couple. I mean, I can't think of that many, but I can think of a couple of examples of male characters. So Supernatural show I enjoy. That's guilty pleasure. Not gonna lie. Some visually pleasing show. So in one of those episodes, one of the male leads has a heart attack. Actually, I feel like he has ongoing heart issues.
Is that Sam or Dean?
That's Dean. He has a heart attack and almost dies.
Oh yeah, he does too. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
In quite an early.
Still here and not a Supernatural viewer.
Anyway, the point is, you have a young male character who is otherwise very, very healthy and very much that sort of conventional American masculinity on show here, and he has a heart attack. So I'm sure in other episodes of that show there are various supernaturally caused heart attacks that affect various kind of side characters, but he's the one that I remember in particular.
It's a ghost-induced Takotsubo syndrome, perhaps.
Well,
maybe.
Exactly. Yes.
That's true. There's some other examples that come to mind from another supernatural themed show, Buffy. Buffy's love interest in season 5, Riley, he was at risk of a heart attack, I think from a drug-induced situation, performance-enhancing drug-induced situation.
Some secret military thing drugging him. That's
yeah. He was on some sort of secret military drugs to make him like a super soldier. If you haven't watched that far in that show yet, we've just spoiled it. But it is over 20 years old, so I mean,
if you haven't watched it by now, shame on you.
There was a bit of digging into this. There's a bit part character or a side character. There's a psychic character called Cassie in season 7 who died from a heart attack. This was quite unusual. It's a young female character dying of congenital heart failure.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. I do, and apart from that young female character, I think the sort of the earth-shattering moments, the glamorous moments, the heroic moments are all about men. And one that springs to mind for me is James Bond. No comments, no judgment. James Bond, I think it's Casino Royale, where he's given some drugs that affect his heart and he goes into a life-threatening rhythm and he defibrillates himself because he's just that amazing.
That's right. I forgot.
I know. So, I mean,
was it in his car he did that? I'm just trying to remember. Yeah.
Right.
I know. And I just admire him so much for being able to do that, really, because
that's why you admire him. Yeah.
That not every man or woman could do that. So it's quite glamorous. James Bond is quite glamorous doing his own defibrillation.
That's impressive. Yeah.
It is impressive, impressively something.
And also classically masculine character as well.
Yes, and he's grunting, he's got the left arm pain. And then I was just thinking, in contrast, there is another female character that has come to mind who was experiencing a heart attack. Now, this is quite interesting because it was Dr. Miranda Bailey in Grey's Anatomy. So we have here a woman who's set up to be medically astute. She knows her stuff, right? She self-identifies her symptoms, but one of her colleagues doesn't take her seriously. So, this is how hard it is for women to think about how they're going to feel themselves, how they're going to recognize their own symptoms, and how they're going to find those symptoms acceptable to a particular medicos that they might go and see. So with her, they didn't actually even believe she was having a heart attack. So, I mean, I think this is really pivotal in what we're talking about today, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Good find, Breed. I think that episode sounds worthy of a podcast in itself. Maybe what we should actually have done is have a Heart of the Matter podcast, which was really just a Grey's Anatomy fan show. I don't know.
Well,
to be honest, I would accept that over the supernatural one, thanks. But
I don't know where Grey's is still going.
Grey's is long stopped, I think, but there's a rich vein to tap in the Grey's Anatomy cardiovascular areas. I know there's a whole VAD storyline in there as well. So maybe we might have instead of an article, one episode, we might have to watch an episode and break it down and bust some myths that might be there, or
I think what we could do is we could re-edit all of our podcasts, and as we finish them and say, well, how is this dealt with in Grey's Anatomy for every single subject?
Yeah, because it's probably covered at some point.
Yeah.
Do you know, Reed, I thought for a second you were going to say reenact. I thought that's where you were going. Reenact Grey's Anatomy.
I'll be James Bond. I will defib myself.
Pay good money to see that.
I've got the training. I've got the training. I'm going to share a secret, which hopefully not many people have noticed, but I usually put up that little clip on Facebook on my Facebook page every time I pass my advanced life support training. I know, just saying. Right.
Well,
we digress. We digress.
So so we're not the only ones who've kind of started to look into this. When I did a bit of digging online, I found quite a handy open access article entitled Heart in Art, Cardiovascular Diseases in Novels, Films and Paintings. Now that was published just in 2020, so relatively recently, in the journal Philosophy, Ethics and Humanities in Medicine. So there are other scholars sort of looking into cultural representations of cardiovascular disease. And in 2019, Deborah Lupton, a professor of the Vitalities Lab at the Center for Social Research in Health and Social Policy Center at UNSW, so that's Michael's stomping ground. Professor Lupton wrote a piece for The Conversation about how TV shows usually depict middle-aged white businessmen having heart attacks, and she cites Mad Men as an example, and she asks, and I quote, "Can you think of any women in news reports, magazines, literary fiction, television drama, or film who have been depicted having a heart attack or with any other symptoms of heart disease?" So I think that we've kind of preempted that question a bit in this episode, and we've usefully found a few, but possibly they are the exceptions to the rule. And as Lupton points out, even though we're just talking about entertainment, the lack of representation has serious consequences. We look at the way heart disease is modeled on television, at the movies, and that affects our expectations and how we monitor our own bodies and our loved ones.
You're absolutely right, Claire. And unfortunately, this it's all starting to be recognised. So the Heart Foundation provides now some special information on women and heart disease, and we'll pop the link to that in the show notes with all the other links to all the other papers we've discussed today. And as Nikki Stamp points out in the book, she points to campaigns such as Go Red for Women and Making the Invisible Visible, which are raising awareness of heart disease for women. But really, there's such an exciting potential here, which you both highlighted already, for interventions in the health humanities and perhaps for creative arts as well.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that we will keep coming back to here at Heart of the Matter. Unfortunately, we are out of time today, so we should just thank you for joining us, and we look very much forward to your company the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.